This gospel is the reason why priests aren't sent to their home parishes for assignments, because if they threw Jesus off a cliff, I could only imagine what they would do to lowly old parochial vicar Father James. Well, I really enjoyed the Ask Father James, Ask Me Anything sessions on our parish Facebook and YouTube pages that I've done over the last couple months. And so you can check those out if you haven't seen them. They're still recorded. And I like them not the least of which because, well, our faith grows when we take time to ponder it, when we recognize that Jesus, who is the Logos, as we hear from the first chapter of John, Logos, or reason or word, literally the fundamental ordering principle through whom all things were made, such that as we ponder our faith, we recognize more and more the depth behind all the reasons, what we believe, why we believe them, what we do, why we do them. And then to share this with others too is a great gift and an opportunity for our faith to grow. But one topic that I enjoy pondering is creation, evolution, original sin, and Genesis. Because the more that we understand our past, the better we're able to understand the present. And so I've heard it asked before, well, why didn't God just create humanity in paradise, in heaven? If that's where he wanted us to be, well then, why not just put us there? Well, the simple answer is basically, he did. Just read Genesis chapters 2 and 3 and you'll get the picture. There are very few scriptural texts with as much depth as those first few chapters of Genesis, because they are, of course, foundational. We learn, for instance, that God created humanity intentionally and in friendship with himself, regardless of the ingenious process that got us there. We see that the world was made as a home for us to live in, not just as a hostile wilderness. And that he gave us the freedom to be able to choose to abide in that friendship, abide in the very same love which constitutes paradise. For paradise is Eden, and in Eden, man and woman walked in friendship with God. But if we're made from God and we're made for God, this God who is all good, well then the natural question that follows is, what about evil? We read in Vatican II's Lumen Gentium, for when man looks into his own heart, he finds that he is drawn towards what is wrong and sunk in many evils which cannot come from his good Creator. As our first reading puts it, we come to recognize, when we just take a moment to think about it, that we all are more than we would like to be, hard of face and obstinate of heart. Here too, Genesis 3 has much to teach us. When our first parents succumbed to the seduction of evil, they chose that which would cast them out of paradise. They chose doubt. They chose death. They chose, however ignorantly and simply, to reject friendship with God. Let's go even deeper. Bear with me. Recall that their sin was to disobey God's command to not eat of the tree of good and evil. So in more general terms, we could say that what they chose to do was really to disobey the limit set by God. And oddly, the serpent argues that if they do disobey this limit, that they will themselves, quote, become like gods. What does this tell us? That the original sin was a refusal to accept our limits. That the original sin was a refusal to accept our dependence. Here's what I mean. What makes God God and us not is that God is the creator and we the creature. Easy enough. God eternally is, and we need not be. We received our existence without our choosing, and likewise, we can lose our existence without our permission. This is to say, we are finite. We are limited as creatures, whereas God, understood properly, is not. Thus, by definition, as creatures, we depend on God. Without God, we wouldn't exist. Then, now, never. The core of our being as created beings is dependence. And dependence means a limit. Let's take this a step further. Not only is our existence limited, but the way in which we exist is limited. And hopefully this is obvious. We cannot sprout wings like birds, nor can we process oxygen out of water like fish. There are physical limits to all creatures, and to reject these limits as if they didn't exist is, well, absurd, because as we all know, to jump out of a plane and try to go skydiving or to try to go scuba diving without the proper equipment does not end well. Well, the same applies to morality. God has built limits into his creation about how we should and shouldn't behave. To refuse these limits and to reject them as if they didn't exist, well, not only is that absurd, but likewise, it's actually the very same thing as the original sin. Why? Because it's to disobey the limit set by God. Not an arbitrary limit, mind you, but indeed a limit built into reality itself by the one who is the source of reality. For if we don't depend on God to show us the purpose of things, the morality of things, then we have listened to the serpent's words. To become our own gods who decree for ourselves what is good and evil. And yet at the same time, choose that which would cast us out of paradise. For to sin is to say no to God's friendship, and thereby to say no to living in relation with the one who is the source of life and existence itself. In this light, hopefully we can see why we so quickly even come to doubt the wisdom of the limits set by our Creator. Because we are sons and daughters of Adam. We are children of that same original sin. We have a bent towards rejecting dependence upon God and doubting the wisdom of our limits. So much so that to our wounded nature, limits and dependence seem like bad words. Like shackles that are placed on our freedom. Whereas today, freedom is the very thing that we celebrate. But for St. Paul, as all of us have just heard, Our dependence upon God and the limits set by God mean not shackling, but indeed redemption. I will boast most gladly of my weaknesses in order that the power of Christ might dwell in me. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And power is made perfect in weakness. To accept our limitedness as creatures and to accept our dependence upon God for everything is not a chaining of our freedom. It's actually what our freedom was made for. Contrary to what our wounded nature would have us assume, it is indeed the paradise for which we long. You see, there is good news behind all of this. In our brokenness, in our sin, in our weaknesses, we encounter once again our fundamental dependence upon God. And here, we have a choice to make. In the face of our weaknesses, in the face of our sin, in the face of our limitedness, we could either depend on ourselves and try to become, as the serpent tempted us, like gods, or we could accept our limits, accept our weaknesses, and let God raise us to paradise. Because to accept our dependence on God for our existence and indeed for our salvation is to accept that we were first of all chosen to exist, intentionally created, and furthermore, chosen once again for new life, despite our weaknesses. This is to say that if at the core of our being is dependence on God, then so too at the core of our being is being seen, being known, being chosen and loved by the God of the universe. To reject that is to reject paradise. But to accept that is redemption. And it means that our lives would even be defined by divine love. This Independence Day, let us boast of our dependence on God. For we were not made to be free from God, but free for God. For the God who invites us to paradise.